Right, as we near the end of today, we're going to turn our attention to the government's role in the race to net zero. So please do welcome Pierre Shepherd. He's interim chair of the Policy Liaison Group on ESG, College Green Group. Pierre, welcome.
Thank you. Thank you, Simon. And thank you to Speedy for inviting me to speak today about what's going on in Westminster and to the viewer for tuning in. So, as Simon said, I run the Policy Liaison Group on ESG in Westminster, which will be my first slide. I'm just going to set the scene about what we do. Alongside Speedy, Speedy sits on our advisory board, which is extremely important from a technical point of view because our role is to convene stakeholders, including Speedy and financial services institutions, and convey what's going on in industry, what's going in financial services with respect to sustainability to parliamentarians and ministers who often sit at our roundtables. Roundtables are our key function. That's where we drive consensus. That's where we collaborate openly, as I say, with multiple stakeholders. And we get that consensus quite simply, and then we take that forward, and that's our cross-party engagement. I say cross-party and not just Westminster engagement because in Westminster and indeed across UK government, Whitehall, regulators, it's best to you want to find those positions where there is clear cross-party consensus, where you're in the mainstream of opinion, of technical guidance from, as I say, organisations like Speedy and so forth, and put forward those recommendations. Just one other point to add on in this area is that we're always looking to focus on those challenges that companies of all sizes are facing and where government can step in and support them. And then more broadly, of course, going back to the purpose of this presentation is to look at net zero and see how we can shift the dial as a UK economy with government working in partnership with the private sector. So as I say, I'll be going back to some of the consensus we've had at our roundtables, which is why I wanted to kick off with that slide. So the kind of net zero story that we have in the UK, just setting the scene here on the kind of the legacy we've got so far. It has to be said the UK is a leader. We saw this, of course, at COP26 in Glasgow, but the COP we've just had in Baku was a real indication of UK leadership, partly because there's somewhat of a vacuum. We do live in a more troubled world than we did then, and Sir Keir Starmer was one of the few leaders to go to COP, but I'll touch on that a bit later. Key thing about the UK compared to international peers is that our commitment to climate change is in statute. The UK government can and has been taken to court for not laying down a strong enough roadmap towards meeting net zero. And of course, that target is to reach 100% emissions reduction compared to 1990 levels by 2050, which I won't be reading out all the lines verbatim like that, but that's an absolute key one. Another thing that's key is the focus on the built environment because so much of emissions is accounted for by the sector. Then we go the layer down. This feeds into COP as our nationally determined contributions. Our target for 2030 is 68%. And just a few days ago, in fact, our target for 2035 was set, and that's at 81% by the Climate Secretary, Ed Miliband. And then internally, the Climate Change Committee that you see listed there sets our targets through carbon budgets. We're aiming currently 52% by 2027. Point is, you get the picture, is that we've got the machinery inside the state to ensure that we've got these interim targets and we're working towards them. And in fact, the UK has exceeded the last 3 carbon budgets, in spite of the fact that the state has been scrutinised in the courts. Last point I just want to make here is a less kind of concrete one, is that we're seeing some really important appointments in recent years to help really spearhead the race towards net zero. So one of them was Chris Skidmore, former Conservative MP, who published a landmark report called Mission Zero. Mission is very much a key word here, as you'll see later in the presentation, but also because the government set up the Mission Control Department within the Department for Energy Security and Net Zero. This is as I say, a small department that looks to join up all the thinking between the different government departments. One of the huge challenges with net zero is that it cuts right across government, indeed right across the private sector as well. It's the private sector that's going to deliver net zero. And this is something that perhaps we, when I say we, in Westminster, is something that's been misunderstood. And that's why, if I don't mind saying so myself, groups like mine on the Policy Liaison Group are so important in providing that partnership. So if we just move on quickly, one thing I've missed about the Climate Change Committee is it sets legally binding targets in the form of those carbon budgets, but also sets roadmaps for individual sectors, and this is absolutely pivotal. Goes back to my point about the private sector. Won't spend too much time on this slide, but I just want to point out that there is that level of analysis. Viewers will be looking at this and thinking, well, this is all well known to us, heat pumps and so forth, but at the same time, the analysis does go deeper, and it shows that the necessary work is being done behind the scenes. Now, just taking things forward to more recent events, to the election, of course, we had, and Labour's focus and some of the policies that have come out. I want to just focus on two things to begin with. We are seeing, as I'm sure everyone viewing is aware, a much more emphasis on transitioning to a greener economy and to reaching net zero by the Labour government, which of course has a big majority. This was outlined in the manifesto commitments. Coming into this new government, Labour strategists drew up this idea of five missions, and the first two relate directly to net zero. And the first, of course, is kickstarting economic growth, and the second is making Britain a clean energy superpower. This is a really important interrelationship between the two missions, because if we are to achieve net zero, if we're to bring the whole of society with us and transition the economy via a just transition, we need to be driving economic growth through those sustainability, through a more sustainable economic model. This brings me on to securonomics. Securonomics is a term coined by the Chancellor Rachel Reeves, but I wanted to drop it in because it goes to the heart, I think, of this, of what I've just mentioned about economic growth and making Britain a clean energy superpower, in that the government intends to run a supply side economic policy and pick its champions to help drive the right kind of economic behaviour. And given the attention paid to the green transition, there was a green prosperity plan, for instance, one of many documents published before the election as part of the wider manifesto. There is that commitment, and we should be seeing those champions, those sectors selected and championed. Now, onto the more specific policies. Some of these I'll go through a bit more quickly, but we'll start off with Great British Energy, or GB Energy, public company that's capitalised with £8.3 billion public money to help nurture investment in other renewable technologies. Now, the truth is, this was received with a bit of scepticism when it was unveiled before the election. It made its way right at the top of the King's speech. We really don't know if we're looking at something really radical that's going to be targeting innovative new energy, new technologies that won't be able to scale up without public funding, or if we're looking at a bit more of a traditional model that's just seeking to get more renewable energy into the UK's energy mix. We'll wait and see. Crown Estates Bill, this is quite straightforward really, in that the Crown Estates has stewardship over the seabed of England and Wales, needs reforming if we're to have more offshore wind, and also if we're to explore CCUS, which, like the previous Conservative government, Labour are interested in doing. In fact, the two projects have already been sanctioned. Then we've got National Wealth Fund. It's along the same lines of GB Energy. In a lot of the material that's been published, there's a direct link with green prosperity, with transition, but at the same time, there's a lot of talk about national wealth fund serving a kind of levelling up agenda. Levelling up not being language that the Labour government used, but it amounts to the same thing. So I think there's competing objectives here, as well as engineering a green transition, supporting net zero. Sustainable aviation fuels, the Labour government's looking to achieve some market certainty there. And then on to the Warm Homes Plan. This, in my mind, is very important indeed. It feeds, of course, it relates directly to the built environment, which I already mentioned accounts for a huge proportion of emissions. And more importantly, the government's shown a real intent here. So in the first 3 years of the government, we're going to see a high level of spending out of the total budget of 6.6 billion. The other thing that's come out, and it's only in the last couple of weeks actually, is that first of all, there's been a doubling of funding for the boiler upgrade scheme, but also some reforms of the restrictions. So for instance, the heat pumps under the Conservatives were only allowed to be within a metre of a property. That has been scrapped. So as part of the wider effort to make planning easier in the UK, make development easier, we're also seeing retrofitting and energy efficient solutions become easier. We're only at an early stage. A consultation has also just been released, one of many in this area, with regard to net zero. So there's much to be seen, but at the same time, and incidentally, the consultation was on insulation, GBIS and Eco4. We are seeing that movement, but it is still early days. We're at the 6-month stage, of course. Now, I put here as my final bullet point, decarbonising electricity by 2030. Now, this is a target that's been flung around. It was in the manifesto, featured prominently. It does in our roundtables. Sometimes we get a bit of a negative reaction. Not that it shouldn't happen, but that it's unlikely. The National Energy Systems Operator published a report recently saying that it is possible. That's where the quote's lifted from, but it would need a heavy amount of alignment and a scaling up and a speeding up of collaboration towards reaching net zero, towards deploying more renewable technology, including carbon capture and storage. Labour have itemised some of the things they're going to do, SMRs and so forth. I won't go into SMRs being small modular reactors, onshore wind, which has already been sanctioned. That was something the Conservatives didn't sanction, but that's probably a little bit too granular for the time being. The point being is that, again, the signs are good, but we're still early days. I think in many ways, if we were looking to draw conclusions on what we've seen so far from Labour, it's probably what's not been done or said. So, for instance, if we look at electric vehicles, there's been a lot of criticism this week. Front page of the Daily Mail criticised the government for having a shambolic electric vehicles plan. We've had commentary more than commentary, for both Ford and Stellantis have announced closures and job losses. Some of those jobs will be transferred, but the Luton plant will see 1,100 jobs lost. This is a really important point. I just want to dwell on it a little bit, because I've already mentioned about that kind of two sides of the same coin between economic growth and making Britain a clean energy superpower. In other words, green growth, sustainable growth. But we're already seeing examples of that tension. And what I see a lot in my roundtables is how we need to win the narrative at all levels, not just in terms of net zero. Every discussion has an opportunity for a narrative to prevail over the others. And so the challenge here, of course, is that people's lives are being affected by a transition being engineered by the government. So there is a target, a 2035 target at the moment for all vehicle sales to be electric. That's being scaled up. So in this year, auto manufacturers, if they will be fined if less than 22% of their sales are electric vehicles. Ford and Stellantis have taken the opportunity to argue back at the government and say that you're not providing enough incentives to purchase these vehicles, and that's behind these big decisions. There's a lot to unpick for the government. It's very challenging. It's a bit disappointing to see the business secretary say that that they've inherited a bad policy, because really Labour haven't done much. I would say rightly, they promised from the outset that the pushing back of the 2030 target to 2035 would be reversed. We'd be looking at 2030 again. In theory, we are looking at 2030 because of the decarbonisation of all electricity in the UK that I already mentioned. But there's just not much movement going on here. And as I say, there's some serious decisions being made in the private sector that have to be engaged with, and we need robust policies to deal with them, and so that the narrative moves on in favour of sustainable growth. Now, so here we're on to my kind of bread and butter, which is the disclosure side, the ESG side, and green finance. So the outset, as you can see here from my little breakdown, you've got the financial side and the real economy side. And the thing that's really I want to point out here is that the UK has really spearheaded disclosures in financial reporting, or rather non-financial reporting in financial services, so that those disclosures cascade downwards. I know from our work with Speedy and our other partners that this can be very challenging when it comes to the real economy, because they're often dealing with SMEs, for instance, that don't have the resources to provide the necessary disclosures. But the government's thinking, understandably, is that the incentives work through investment. If you have a sustainable, if you're a company in the real economy, and you have a robust transition plan, or you can have a lot of strong green credentials, you're showing how you're reducing your negative impact, or the opposite, that you're providing direct positive impact, then you'll be rewarded in the investment markets. And the UK government has undertaken those measures to build a robust, stable, well-functioning green finance market. So this all started with the Task Force for Climate-Related Financial Disclosures at COP in Glasgow. It was announced that this would be made mandatory for large financial institutions and companies, it has to be said, but the focus is on finance. This is followed by the Financial Conduct Authority, the UK regulator, to bring in SDR, sustainability disclosure requirements, investment labels, to encourage funds that only invest in assets that have a strong sustainability profile, and then brought in also an anti-greenwashing rule, which goes back to what I was saying about creating green finance markets that are robust. At the heart of that is the creation of a green taxonomy. This is something we worked on at length, my group, on ESG. We published a report in 2022 about the need for an interoperable and usable green taxonomy, to contrast with the EU one. The EU one we would want to be interoperable with, but we want to be a bit more usable. A green taxonomy, by the way, is a reference tool, and it shows you what counts as a sustainable economic activity and what isn't. Now, the problem, though, with a tool like that is that only a tiny proportion of economic activity is sustainable. And so really the big question, certainly the question for policymakers, is what about transition? And so this is where the UK is doing leading work. We have the Transition Finance Market Review, which is a government-backed financial services task force, essentially, that recently published its first report about how do we channel more private funding into those transitional technologies and into those companies with robust transition plans. On that point, incidentally, two things that are really important to bear in mind that were in the Labour manifesto were, first of all, to make the UK the green finance capital of the world. Could argue actually that the UK already is, because ESG is in many ways a UK or a City of London invention. But anyway, it's about the spirit of the commitment. and for FTSE 100 companies to be mandated to have mandatory transition plans that are robust and aligned with the Paris climate goal of 1.5 degrees C. So the transition piece is important. And again, the UK is leading in this area. And I think that's something that we have to acknowledge and celebrate, but make sure we move forward with. Just one last thing on the finance side. Mansion House, there's an annual speech by the Chancellor at Mansion House. This occurred 2 weeks ago, and Rachel Reeves released a package of measures. She first of all signposted sustainable finance as one of 5 growth areas in the financial services, which in itself is very important given the size of our financial services sector. And there's the green taxonomy consultation was included in that, incidentally. But also in there was a ESG ratings legislation, which again is really important to provide that confidence in the market for sustainable financial products. And also there's a consultation coming out, again, one of many, like the green taxonomy itself, on integrity principles for voluntary carbon markets, which, again, you're probably seeing a theme emerge now. There's a lack of confidence in this particular market. It's under-regulated. There have been some scandals. And there's a need for regulation, but there is also a need, again, for more collaboration and for a narrative to emerge where people are championing these solutions to meet net zero alongside the necessary regulatory principles and frameworks. Onto the real economy. I've already covered really the transition plan part, but there is a kind of a sister project of the transition finance market review, which is a transition plan task force. This is a framework for credible corporate net zero transition plans. We had them in for one of our roundtables, and this is really important pioneering work because we're not seeing it to as great extent in the rest of the world. And then UK industrial strategy doesn't quite fit into this kind of menu of government corporate reporting and ESG reporting. However, it is absolutely pivotal. It links in back with what I said about the 2035 target for electric vehicles being phased out. What we hear time and again in our roundtables is that we need clear indications from government where the direction of the economy is going to go. What are the champions that are going to pick? What are the companies that are going to be rewarded and supported by the government in one way or the other? This is the map that an industrial strategy is supposed to provide us with. We haven't had one in a while. The indications from the consultation that have just come out indicate that it will be focused towards a greener economy, and certainly we hope so as a group. So just to round off, it's a mixed picture, as you say. The government traditionally has been, in the last few years, since COP, I would say, has congratulated itself a lot for being a leader in achieving net zero. And rightly so, as you can see, we're approaching 40% renewables. That's a slightly exaggerated figure because it's the absolute top end. We've got that regulation. I mentioned TCFD. We were the first to do that. We've got the architecture with the Climate Change Committee and so forth. And then the leadership piece, which I mentioned at the beginning. But there are those dangers. I think what's encouraging about mission control is that government is looking at a joined-up approach between various departments, which is absolutely essential. However, as I see through my own group, there isn't the necessary level of engagement with the private sector. Then, of course, there are the political headwinds. We've recently had the election of Donald Trump in the United States. That he's a figure who's directly challenging the narrative that we need to win around sustainable growth. The narrative, of course, which blends in with my next point. And then finally, on the green finance side, things like the taxonomy, which I keep talking about, they're absolutely pivotal. We're still in early stage. The EU has a taxonomy and the UK doesn't. So we need to keep the momentum going on that. And we have to remind ourselves that in straitened economic times, we only need to look at our recent budget. we won't be achieving net zero without leveraging an absolutely enormous amount of private finance towards meeting growth. And that means green finance markets have to be prioritised. So thanks so much for listening in. I hope I was able to enlighten you a bit about green finance, ESG, and of course, our race to net zero. And I'll hand over to Simon. Thank you very much.
You did, Pierre. Thank you so much. And never easy being the last one of the day on, but thank you. And thank you to all of our speakers and panelists today. It has been, I'm sure you'll agree, a really, really good day of learning and inspiration. I've actually learned a lot today, and I hope you have watching on as well. Achieving sustainability, as I'm sure you've learned throughout the day, requires collaboration, requires innovation and action at every single level.